Hi, today we're going to be learning how to make cutscenes in pygame, such as the one you're watching now. I'm going to show you my process of writing a cutscene and also how to manage them in a game, because it's likely that we'll have several cutscenes and we need a way of organising the code so it won't become too cumbersome as our game gets bigger and bigger. All the code shown in this video will be on GitHub, and there's a link in the description. And finally, this is my first tutorial video, so I'd really appreciate any feedback on the pace, less or more detail, or just generally anything to improve it. Yeah, I'd really appreciate that. Okay, let's make a cutscene. So here I've created a minimal example for how to do a cutscene in pygame. In this tutorial we're going to be just working with two scripts. One is our main game loop here on the left called main, and then secondly a script containing all of the logic for our cutscenes, so a cutscene manager and also an example of a cutscene. So like the cutscene that I showed in the introduction, but this is a way more simple version, just so that we can understand the actual code and logic rather than look at any aesthetics. So here in this very trivial example, and as you can see there's barely any code went into making this. We have a blue square which can move left or right. In this example, when we are travelling to the right and move off the right side of the screen, a cutscene will be triggered. So let's have a look. So it says, hey, get back in the middle, and then I can no longer move the player, but with a spacebar it will move the player back into the middle and then say, yeah, you're now stay there. And again, we still cannot move the player, but when we press spacebar, the cutscene is effectively finished. So that's all we'll look at implementing today. As I said, it's just a very minimal example to understand the code and the logic rather than create something fun and interesting. So the first thing we'll look at is the cutscene manager. Because most games will eventually have many different cutscenes, I think it's important to have some sort of way of managing them so the code base doesn't become too cumbersome and complicated, that if you want to modify any cutscene or add layers of complexity, it just quickly becomes unwieldy. So what I've done is created this very simple cutscene manager class, which is essentially just a utility class, and it has four very simple methods: one for starting a cutscene, one for ending a cutscene, updating the scene, and drawing the scene. The most important methods are these last two, so that's the update and draw. And in the update it will actually go ahead and update the cutscene, and in the draw it will draw it. So because of this, the only thing we need to expose into our main game loop is the cutscene manager and not all of our individual cutscenes. So in this way we keep the main game loop fairly small and concise, because it's only ever seeing the cutscene manager, and it's the manager's job to deal with whatever cutscene it's currently using. And here we can see this is the method that actually takes in the cutscene to be used in the main game loop. If we now go to, I've now also written this, well, the example that we saw when we go off to the right of the screen and then the player comes back. All that code is included into this class here called cutscene1. The way I've created the cutscene manager is that, if I just jump back to the manager, is that this method here for starting a cutscene expects some cutscene object. And the way I've designed these cutscenes to work is this cutscene object is also a class, and very crucially, it requires two methods, and that's update and draw, because those are the methods that will be called during our main game loop through the update and draw methods of the manager. Okay, so now I'll go into a bit of detail into actually how to turn this class into something that produces the cutscene that we've just seen. The first thing that I've included in the class is a declaration of a name variable, and we're just going to call this test. The reason for this is that normally you only ever see one cutscene once, usually because it's part of the story or direction of the game, and once it's done, it's kind of the knowledge is there and you don't really need to show it again. So in order to facilitate this, what I've done is added a cutscenes complete list into the manager, and then every time a cutscene is started, the name of that cutscene is appended to the list, and hence, if we ever go into the same initialization logic of the cutscene, the manager will say, no, we've actually already done that cutscene before, so let's not start this cutscene. The second variable is important because it's the way I've designed how cutscenes are created, and that's through a series of steps. If you imagine normally in a cutscene, it does work as in a series of parts. So there might be one part might be dialogue, another part might be another character moving onto the screen, a third might be the protagonist, the player, following that character. So what I've tried to do is to partition the logic of the cutscene into a series of steps, and that way it makes it easier to sort of design the cutscene in a programmatic way, but also for the player to interact with the cutscene. And, for example, a spacebar might skip to the next step, or we could also have like an escape to just exit out of the cutscene. But the way I've designed it, is a series of steps, and each one has its own logic. I've put a timer in here just in case certain parts of the cutscene require a timer, but that's not mandatory. And then we also have this Boolean variable to indicate whether the cutscene is actually running or not. And we need that because actually that's our way for the manager to know has the cutscene finished or not. So if we look down in the update function, we have this self.cutscene running equals the update method of the cutscene. And how we've worked that is at the end of the update method in the cutscene, we actually keep returning this Boolean value. So if ever the Boolean is returned as false, then the manager will see cutscene running equals false. And then when it sees cutscene running equals false, it then goes ahead to end that cutscene. So that's why that particular Boolean variable is important. I've also passed the player into this cutscene. Now, that's only because this cutscene actually controls the player in some way. If the cutscene had nothing to do with the player, like didn't affect its movement or anything, or any of its variables, then we wouldn't need to pass this. But because this particular cutscene does control the player, that's why it's been put there. And lastly, I've just created a small dictionary of some text. So certain parts of the cutscene will use this text. All of this, if the cutscene is very big and you have many lines of text, you may want to store this in another script or JSON file. But right now, because we've only got 2 lines, it's easy enough just to stick it into the init method. We've also created a text counter, and that's just for the text to kind of gradually appear like letter by letter rather than the entire block of text appearing at once. So now back to how the code has been created with these steps. If we look at the update method, what we can see is a series of if statements. So this is conceptually very easy to understand that if we're in step 0, which is what it's initialized as, we do this. but not the rest of this logic. Whereas if we're in step 1, we do this block of code, and also step 2, this block of code. So in that way, it just controls the different parts of the cutscenes, and a very similar logic to the draw logic. Only on certain steps do we actually want to, in this case, blitz some text to the screen. Okay. So yeah, that's an example of a cutscene, and that's generally how this manager works. Now let's jump over to our main game loop and script to understand actually how to implement these things into our game. So the first thing we need, as I said before, because the main game loop only actually interfaces with the cutscene manager, the only thing we need to do is first initialize the cutscene manager class, and because this class will actually blitz text and stuff to the screen, we need to pass it our game screen. Then the other parts where we see the cutscene manager is in the update part of our game loop. So this is the part where our cutscene update methods will be run, and similarly we have a cutscene manager draw, and normally this will come as one of the last things to draw because it should really go on top of everything else. So that's all working fine, and the manager is in all the places it needs to be. But what we need to do now is work out how we're actually going to start our cutscene. Now, this can happen in several places in a game. In the example that I've done here, it's actually the player that kicks off this cutscene, and that happens when the player actually goes too far to the right, actually crosses the right hand side of the screen. So what I've done is I've actually included that logic into the player class, and so that's where you see inside the player's update function we pass it the cutscene manager, and we have this simple logic that says if the x value of our player rectangle surpasses the width of the screen, we're going to go ahead and use the start cutscene method in the cutscene manager, and we're going to pass it the cutscene that we want. In this case, cutscene 1, which is the cutscene that I've just described. And in cutscene 1, we actually need to play it. We need to pass it the player itself, so that just goes in as self because we're already in the player class. So that's the simple way of kind of initializing this cutscene and passing it into our manager. And then the other thing that we need to do is just to note if a cutscene is happening, we don't want to have the player has lost its ability to move, because the game has sort of effectively stopped, but it's not like a menu where you just create a whole new surface for the game. It's rather you just disable the player's movement, and yeah, that's pretty much everything. And just to run the cutscene again, so hopefully now how it all happens is a bit more clear. So right now the cutscene manager is none, because that's what it initializes as, and so we can move the player, and as we move across to the end of the screen, the cutscene manager is initialized with the start cutscene method, and we are in step 0 of our cutscene 1, and so this is just printing this self.text1, which is in the draw method, and once it's finished the text, we can press space to move on to step 1 in this case, which is where the player is moved back to the center of the game. Again, and then once the player is back in the center, then we go into the final step, which is another piece of dialogue. Pressing space again will then finish this cutscene. So yeah, that's more or less how I've been creating cutscenes in my game. I hope the code is generalizable enough for other people to use it in their games, but please let me know if something doesn't work for you or something is unclear. I'd be very happy to answer any questions in the comments. Okay, thanks.